Welcome everybody to the Gloria Ferrer Masterclass, the final one of the series here where we're going to be talking to you about some still wine. I am Kyle Altomare, the winemaker here at Gloria Ferrer, and to my right is Brad Kurtz, our vineyard director, and we have some fantastic wines that we're going to get in our glass while we talk to you guys about the differences between sparkling production and still production. So,
all right,
if you guys have wine at home, please feel free, get some in your glass. We've got some Carneros Chardonnay and Carneros Pinot Noir here. Brad, there's a lot of differences when it comes to growing and making still wine versus sparkling, right?
Yeah.
And a majority of both of our careers have been spent with still wines. So this is a topic that's near and dear to our hearts. So let's dive right in. We have still wine grapes on the property. How do we figure out what grapes are destined for still wine and what grapes are destined for sparkling?
Yeah. So we've talked about this a little bit from the sparkling aspect, but we haven't really dove into it on the still wine aspect yet. So just to give a little background, we had some big fires in 2020, if we all recall.
Yep.
We decided not to make any still wines from 2020. And that kind of allowed us to hit the reset button a little bit. I was new coming in 2021, and so I had no experience with this property. I had notes of historical blocks and vineyards that had been used for still wine production in the past, and was able to taste through some of those wines and see some of them I think performed really well and held up over time, aged well.
Definitely.
And showed well, and some of them maybe were stylistically different from what I would do. And then what happened was I looked at our vineyard maps, and I, walked the vineyards, looked at soil maps, looked at the soils in the vineyards, walked a bunch of rows, spent some time with those vineyards and really got to understand them and get a feel for them. That, along with the historical knowledge and tasting the wines that we had made for Pinot Noir and Chardonnay for still wine.
Yeah.
And we really got to narrow it down. We have about 56 blocks on the property, vineyard blocks, which are like fields, the fields, the individual units of vineyards that we have. And I've narrowed it down to about 10 that I thought could potentially make really, really beautiful still wines.
And what are some of the qualifiers? Like when you're walking through, I mean, you get a feel for it, right? You look at the soil, you look at what's going on, but what are some of the qualifiers that you use when we're looking at evaluating still versus sparkling?
Yeah, so we've talked about it a little bit in our master classes at what makes a great sparkling site.
Yep.
And what clones perform well for sparkling and why they perform well. It's essentially the opposite, right? So we're looking for opposite qualifiers for still wine. So especially when it comes to something like Pinot Noir, we're looking for color now.
Yeah.
Now we want color. Now we want a little bit of tannin. We want a little bit of stress in the vines. Those sorts of things are big no-nos for sparkling wine production, but viticulture for still wines, it's a desirable thing. We want really well-drained soils. We want to be able to fine-tune and control the stress of the vines.
Yeah.
In a sparkling wine setting, we don't want those things, right? We just want no stress.
The absence of it.
Yeah, we want the absence of that. So I'm looking at things like hillsides. I'm looking at things like rocky soils. I'm looking for clones that are historically still wine clones that were selected in their history for their attributes in still wine production. Things like Dijon clones. We have our Alsatian clones. These clones, were selected and propagated because they made good still wines, and because their qualities they lent to a blend benefited that still wine.
Yep.
So, you look at your maps, you see the first thing you look at, where are those still wine clones? Where are those located? They were very strategic when they planted these vineyards. Most of those are located up on the hillsides. There's a reason for that, because that's where the prime soils for still wine production on our vineyards are. All our vineyards are sort of a gradient from higher altitude to the west to lower altitude in the east, both the Circle Bar Ranch and the home ranch. And so all those rockier, more volcanic soils are up on the hillside. It's all from the Sonoma Mountain Range. It's all part of the Sonoma Mountain Range. that's a mountain range of volcanic origin. So we have a lot of this like pumice stone, volcanic rock in there, some red soils, things like that. Some stuff that generally produces really high quality still wines. And so, and I'm speaking more towards Pinot Noir than Chardonnay, but a lot of this is true for Chardonnay as well.
It's a little bit more adaptable, though.
Chardonnay can go a little, it depends on the style of Chardonnay you're looking to make. So Chardonnay is kind of a continuum of styles, and depending on if you want to make this really robust, big Chardonnay or a very elegant, lean Chardonnay, it can depend on the soils. Right now, I'm speaking mostly to Pinot Noir. So for Pinot Noir, we have these things. So in 2021, what we did is we actually went through and we looked at those 10 or so blocks that we thought would make the best still wines, the best Pinot Noirs, the best red wines. So we've got a map pulled up right now. We're looking at the west half. If you're looking at the map, the left half of the ranch, or left probably 25% of the ranch, those are your rockier soils, your more well-drained soils. You have less vigorous vines there. You're able to induce some sort of stress on the vines, keep the berry size a little bit smaller. But it is, at the end of the day, Pinot Noir. We don't want excessive stress. We don't want, it is not a variety that's well adapted.
It doesn't handle it. Minor stresses, right?
We're talking minor
gentle.
stresses.
We still have to be gentle.
Some of these sites we have essentially get no stress. So, Burgundy's not a place known for its super hot, dry summers. So, Pinot Noir isn't adapted to really a lot of stress, but a little bit of stress can be really nice for wine quality. So once we identified these 10 sites, we essentially roped off about three to five rows of each one and made 2 to 4 barrels from each of these blocks as almost an experiment to kind of see what we have. And we can make those wines and we can taste them and we can find out which ones produce what style of wine. And then which ones create different components for different blends. And from there, we were able to put together 3 different blends. So that's kind of how we identified the sites. And maybe some of those sites really shined and really produced phenomenal big Pinot Noirs. Some produced very elegant, fruit-driven Pinot Noirs. Some a little more earthy, some a little more acidity. So it's all about finding what attributes each site provides and what attributes they bring to a blend.
So we're really looking we've got a couple of qualifiers there. We've got elevation, right? And if you're out, and we've got it up on the screen here with blocks F3 for Pinot Noir and F4 for Chardonnay. They're at like you said, they're at the western slopes, and there's a gradient to these, like you said, but what we look at also is what part of that block. Those are 2 fairly big blocks that we have, and we're looking at what part is going in there that's going to make the optimum still wine for these programs here. Also, again, like you mentioned, clones that lend themselves a little bit more towards a more robust style. Flavor development comes on a little bit later. You still get nice acid retention.
If we were to try and make still wines from our sparkling specific, these champagne clones, it would not be good. It would not be the style that we're looking for. They would be borderline rosés, you know? And so it's important to have those clones available and use those for making still wine, because if all we had were those champagne clones, we would not be able to produce still wines on our properties. So elevation, the other thing about elevation that's important to remember is at nighttime, cold air sinks. It flows like water off the hills. So as the air cools down, it kind of flows down that slope towards the valley floor. So what happens is during the daytime, the elevations, because of the wind, are actually cooler, but at nighttime they're warmer. So what ends up happening is you actually develop you retain a little bit less acidity on those hillsides, which is a good thing because Carneros is an extremely cold region. And we can have really cold nights. And so having those hillsides helps metabolize some of that acidity, so we don't end up with these still wines that have sparkling level acidity.
And it's always a switch for us when we're walking through the vineyards too. Once there's that kind of lag period where we finish sparkling harvest, but we haven't really started still harvest yet, and the acidity is so much lower in comparison that you're like, oh, look, we could pick this today, and then it's like, well, hold on. we gotta take a step
We're
back
adjusted
because
to
we're
sparkling
adjusted to
wine.
sparkling. But when you get to the still wine acidity, it's much lower. Almost 50% lower that you're
Yes.
looking at. So you're like, okay, hold on, we actually have to readjust what we're thinking about. And
Yes. We have to recalibrate ourselves.
it's nice to have that little bit of a break to readjust yourself and say, okay, now let's start getting in the still wine mindset. Let's start looking at different things, because the other thing that we start looking at is the accumulation of tannin and how ripe those tannins are, and that's a very vintage dependent thing. When the seed ripeness is the number one thing that we look at, right? When we're going through and those seeds, you crack into them, they're still spongy and green. You get it very, very quickly.
And they can be bitter.
They can be bitter, astringent.
Yeah.
It's not something that we worry about with sparkling wine because we pick so early, and the seeds are never a problem because we press direct off skins. So, but when you're going to use this for like Chardonnay, we macerate Chardonnay for a little bit, or Pinot Noir, you're going to actually ferment on the skins and seeds. You do not want that. So the evaluation for us when we're walking through, after we've selected what blocks it comes from, but the evaluation for when we're actually going to pick is worlds apart in terms of what
It's a totally different set of metrics that we're looking at compared to what we're doing for sparkling wine.
Yeah. And so let's talk a little bit about the clonal differences here, right? So we know that sparkling clones were selected for the lack of color. We know that sparkling clones were selected for their ability to produce a fairly large crop and still retain their flavor profile, right? Let's talk about the management differences in these still wine clones that you do when you're farming for still wine versus sparkling wine.
Yeah, so we'll talk about Pinot and Chardonnay separately because those are very different. Chardonnay, I'm less worried about the skins. I'm less worried about tannin, things like that. It is a white wine at the end of the day, so it has a lot more in common with our sparkling wine production than the Pinot Noir, which we're looking to develop color. Like you said, we're looking to develop those ripe tannins, round tannins, velvety chocolate tannins, not the bitter, astringent, grippy, sandpaper coffee ground tannins.
Yeah, and they can get rough.
We want to extend that hang time, right? So for Pinot Noir, you want clones that are ripening a little bit. They have a longer ripening cycle. They accumulate sugar and degrade acid more slowly so those flavors can develop, so those tannins have time to ripen. All those things are very important. And then when we talk about management styles, we're pruning differently for still wine. We are shoot thinning differently for still wine. We're more aggressively thinning fruit for still wine. When you have things, when you have a crop load or canopy size, we have to look at the ratio between those two things, and we have to understand that we have to develop these flavors and we have to develop the tannins. And if you hang too much fruit out there, it will never happen. And so we need to make sure that we have the canopy to grow and ripen, and the leaves are where all the magic happens, right?
Yep.
And then eventually all that ends up, all those precursors that are created in the leaves and the canopy of the vine end up in the fruit.
Yep.
So we need to create a healthy canopy first to be able to fully ripen that fruit and develop the flavor components that we're looking for. And so a lot of times we prune to fewer buds for still wine. When we shoot them a lot more aggressively. We often are doing shoot positioning. So we will actually tie each individual shoot onto the wire so it spaces them out more evenly. You have to remember still wines are usually hanging out there for a month or so longer than sparkling wine. So different diseases come into play. Things like botrytis can come into play, especially if we get early rains or really heavy fogs. You can have those bunch rots that happening. So we really want to make sure every cluster is hanging freely and separate so we can get airflow in there.
You're not getting clumping going through there.
We don't want them to clump at all. Yeah. But also part of that clumping is making sure we get even sun exposure on them. If they're all clumped together, the fruit on the inside isn't getting any sun exposure, while the fruit on the outside gets excessive sun exposure. And sunlight can really affect the development of anthocyanins, which is that red pigment that we all love. And it can affect the development of tannins and the ripeness of the tannins. So when we're farming these vineyards, we have to make sure the crew knows which rows or which blocks are going to still wine, because it's a totally different set of parameters and totally different set of instructions that we're giving the crew to make sure that, you know, we're meeting our goals for still wine production and we're making higher quality still wines.
So essentially, it's do everything exactly backwards from what you do for sparkling.
It's fairly backwards. I mean, Pinot Noir is, like I said, a very delicate grape still.
Yeah.
So I'm not pulling all the leaves off, but we will tunnel. We call it tunnel leafing.
Yep, go through the
where,
middle.
you know, if you have your canopy that is about a foot wide or 18 inches wide, you might pull the leaves in the center to help with airflow, get some dappled light in there.
Yeah.
I'm not going to strip leaf it, and it just is no leaves from here down and just fruit. So, you know, it's still a very delicate variety, so we have to be careful with it, but we do treat it very differently than we would sparkling wine.
Yeah, we want to get some of that color development there. We want to get the tannin ripeness. So there's one specific block on the property that I think is near and dear to a lot of hearts with not only with our consumers, but with us as well. It's become a wine club favorite here, and it's on our Circle Ball Ranch. So let's talk a little bit about, you were talking about soil earlier, and that's the number one evaluation that we use for still wine versus sparkling wine, right? We need those well-drained soils, rockier the better, create the stress, but still retain water.
Low water holding capacity. We really want to control the stress, right?
Yes.
We don't want to just create lots of stress. We want to control it. So I assume you're speaking about L block.
That is it.
That's
that's the one.
That's what you were going towards.
Yep.
But L block is in the very northwest corner of our Circle Bar Ranch. It's made up of 3 separate blocks. They're all Dijon Clone Pinot Noir. When we did that little trial in 2021, when we made a few rows of each block, you know, when you go through and you're tasting barrels, they're all in a line. We're going through with the wine thief, pulling out samples of each barrel. Then we hit the L block barrels, and our minds were just blown.
Yeah.
I mean, it was really very clear from the start that this was a special site.
Yep.
This first year, we didn't do that much dramatic difference in farming between L block and some of the other blocks we were doing for still wine. We didn't know that was going to be the special.
That was the site.
Special site.
Yeah.
You know, there was a lot of other sites that also showed a lot of potential, but that one, once it was in barrel, it was evident that this was a special wine.
Yeah.
So now, of course, we've identified that, and we spend a lot of extra time in L block. The crew does 2 to 3 extra passes through there, making sure everything is perfect. Every single vine is perfect, perfectly balanced. All the shoots are positioned perfectly. And, you know, the fruit is thin to make sure each vine can support that. And we can get the concentration we're looking for. We can get the ripeness. We can get the hang time that we're looking for. I'm up there walking that block every 3 to 4 days, just making sure that everything looks good, that the vines aren't overly stressed. They have the water that they need. It is extremely well-drained soils up there, very shallow soils. I mean, it's basically just on volcanic rock.
Yep.
And so it's a really unique site, and it's something that we've both grown to love, and it's something very special.
And it's nice because it's a different soil series than anywhere else on the property. Laniger loam, right? And then there's also that nice bit of rip of red volcanic soil that runs through the center, right?
Yep.
Let's talk about the clones that are up there, right? Because these are all Dijon clones. So,
Correct.
In your opinion, because you farm Pinot a lot, you've farmed Pinot on the Central Coast, you've farmed Pinot at Carneros, all over. Talk to me a little bit about Dijon clones and what they were selected for historically, and what they bring on this site here in L Block.
So Dijon clones, as the name might suggest, are from Dijon, which is a town in Burgundy.
Yep.
And so it is a well-known region for Pinot Noir in Burgundy, and a well-known region specifically for producing red wines from Pinot Noir, red Burgundies, if you will. And those wines in California have been heralded as some of the better clones for making red wine. They're very widely adapted, and people really like them. We have 2 of those Dijon selections. We have 777, 777, and we have 115 are the 2 selections we have. So we have L1 and L2 are both 115, and L3 is 777. So that basically gives us some blending components. But the true beauty of that block is that those 3 individual parcels within L block each give us something dramatically different. And the clones are important, but I think the site trumps everything there.
Yes.
And we have, like you said, we've got that rip of red soil through there, which the vines look completely different on that soil than a couple rows over on the more traditional Laniger loam. We've got that super steep east-facing slope on L3 and the vines are a little denser planted on L3, and it's a little bit less rocky there.
Yeah.
And it hangs a little bit longer. It tends to ripen a little slower there. So we get in that little corner of Circle Bar Ranch, we get huge diversity.
And it goes down the hill, so it loses the sunlight faster.
Yeah,
right?
exactly.
It's if you could define a microclimate on our estate, it's El Block.
Yeah.
And it's those 3 blocks individually. And I mean, we've got kind of a beauty shot here as we're going to show of why, not only the view, but you can see here that this is just such a iconic piece of dirt here, where we get that more marine influence here from being about a mile farther south. It tends to be, average of 2 degrees cooler, but just the topography there, the aspects, the soil, everything is completely different than the rest of our site, and it truly makes some spectacular wine. And as you said, we have kind of a strategy now that we've been working with it for a number of years now, where we look at this site as individual sites within individual blocks, right? This is where we get
it's on a row by row
granular.
or even like half a row by row basis.
Yep.
We get really granular. We're lucky because we're 90% sparkling wine.
Yep.
So when still wine harvest comes around, we really are just
can
kind
do
of
crazy
twiddling
stuff.
our thumbs and doing crazy stuff, because we really have a lot more time on our hands than we do during sparkling harvest. So it's really nice because we can really split hairs and perfect our still wine growing, and make sure that during harvest we don't skip anything. Everything gets the detail that it deserves during that still wine harvest.
Yeah, and I think that's a really good point to talk about, is how granular we do get, because we had in 2023, we did some experimentation with El Block, right, on the winemaking side. And this is something that you and I collaborated on pretty heavily. And we have some maps up here that you and I are familiar with looking at, but let's explain to the viewers right now what we're looking at with these heat maps here.
Yeah. So these are aerial imagery that's flown over our vineyards. It is very, very high resolution, and it's multispectral. So what that means is that it's capturing different wavelengths of light that represent the vigor of the vine. So it's taking lots of pictures, and they're very high resolution pictures, and those pictures are specifically looking at the intensity of certain colors.
Yep.
So certain colors that grapevines exhibit in their leaves when they're growing vigorously. And so what we have here is you have, each dot on these maps represents one vine. So one vine, one dot, and the color that is representing that dot and that vine corresponds to the intensity of pigmentation of those pixels that were taken from that camera. So that's a fancy word of saying more green, bigger, stronger vine, more red, weaker, smaller vine.
Yep.
So what we look at is we see patterns emerge when we look at these, and those patterns are usually driven by soils. It can be other things. It can be, sometimes you'll see it in terms of like virus or disease for the vines, but in this case, it is definitely, and I can promise, it is soil-based,
driven.
because you can walk those rows and you can see the soil change right where those colors change. So this allows Kyle and I to really look at these maps and see where those, almost vine by vine, count how many vines down the row where the soil changes, and make picking decisions based on that.
It really gives us the kind of the head start, right? We have the aerial overhead imagery, and it allows us to draw in paint, right? These lovely little lines that we've drawn on there.
Yeah.
But it allows us to look at this in a different manner and say, this is what we need to focus on. Let's look, we know the row orientation, we know where this is. Let's start maybe 2 rows above this, and then go through the middle of this, and then go 2 rows below this, and let's evaluate the differences. And a lot of this is just, it's taste, right? And these are things that you get out there, like you said, vine by vine, you see it, and as you're popping these berries in your mouth, when you get closer to harvest, you're like, there is a clear distinction.
You can taste it. You can taste the difference.
Yes.
And you'll be walking down a single row, and halfway through the row, you'll look down, the soil's a different color.
Yep.
You'll look to your left and right. The vines are either bigger or smaller,
canopy
have more
different.
crop or less crop.
Yep.
And you can taste it. And that's where we go through and we look at these maps, and we say, okay, we're going to split pick this block. We might pick it 2 to 3 times,
Mm-hmm.
and I'll go through and I will put yellow flagging tape on the vines, and I'll basically tell the crew, you're going to pick until you see the tape, and then you're going to stop and you're going to keep going, and then when the tape starts again, you start picking again, and we're going to leave that other fruit out for maybe it's 2 days, maybe it's a week longer.
Sometimes it's as much as a week.
Yeah, and so within the same block where you have the same clone, same rootstock, essentially the same climate, but just the big difference is the soils, right?
Yep.
You could have a difference between a week in harvest, or maybe we pick them at the same time and we keep them in separate bins.
Fermenters, yeah.
So, they, as they're picking down the row, we'll label, green bin, red bin. And as they hit that red section, they switch and they start putting the grapes in a different bin. And then you can keep them separate in the winery and evaluate them separately, because they're going to bring different attributes to a blend and more complexity.
And it really helps. I mean, I think, when we're talking about having the difference in being able to get things perfectly ripe with still wine is essential, but also being able to give yourself components that are drastically different. And I think this is especially the case for L2, right? And we know there's a section of L2 it tends to come off with a cooler profile of alcohol, right? It's a little bit more menthol driven. It's a little bit cooler climate feel where it's not as robust on the fruit. The fruit tends to be more red, a little bit spicy. And then at the complete opposite end of that block, you get more towards that reserve style of black fruit,
smaller,
bigger
more
tannins,
stressed vines, very, very smaller
berries that give you this immense concentration. And when we're making, we make a smaller amount of still wine than we do sparkling. So having components is not very easy to do, but
especially with L block, when you're limited to just that little corner of the ranch.
Whatever those blocks give us is what we get. You can't go get that anywhere else. There's no land or soil anywhere else. Those clones don't exist except in one more block on the property. It's a very special site. So having the ability to create and actually curate the pick where you are picking for a specific reason. It's very intentional when we're doing this. And as you see there, it gives us opportunities to do things that haven't been done here at Gloria in the past, like add whole cluster to fermentations. And that's something that, if we didn't have the ability to get these wines at their optimum ripeness, we just couldn't do. Whole cluster is something that I really, really love to use within Pinot Noir to create complexity.
It's something that's used for Pinot producers across the world.
All over.
It's a technique that people really have embraced. I think even more recent. It's more traditional style,
definitely coming back into favor.
Yeah.
But you have to get ripeness to let this happen, right?
You have to have that hang time, like we said, that extended hang time.
Yeah, we talk about lignification, which is where the stems actually start to turn into wood, right?
Yeah, brown. They turn from green and fleshy to brown and woody.
And when you get those green stems, it's very hard because you put them in there and it becomes bitter. It becomes vegetal, kind of like an olive character to it of the wines, and that's not necessarily something we want to impart. But what you get when you get the lignified stems and whole cluster is something that is an added layer of tannin. It's a soft tannin. It's wood tannin that just feels so much different. It adds complexity. It adds depth. It also adds structure. To a varietal that's notorious for not having structure, adding a little bit of structure that still maintains the varietal's elegance is absolutely essential. We get very, very granular when we're making things like L block. We have a sorting table that we use, and you sort in the field. We split pick in the field. Then if the quality isn't what we're looking like, what we want when it comes into the winery, we actually have a sorting table up there where we have 6 of us standing around picking out individual clusters.
And it's just a conveyor belt.
It's a conveyor belt.
Fruit slowly comes by and they look at every single cluster.
Yep, and the processing time goes way up. Right?
Yeah.
So this is a wine that we put a lot of effort and a lot of thought into from the very, very beginning, which is again, what we're trying to do is showcase that place, because I think that site is so different than anywhere else on the property, and you can see.
And it's very unique for Carneros even by itself. There's not a lot of sites like that in
Absolutely.
Carneros. There's a few corners of Carneros that have those soils.
Yeah.
And really to be this close to the bay,
this
far south and have this, we may be the furthest south site in Carneros that has that soil.
And one of the higher elevations, right? We were looking at it yesterday. It's about 250, 260 feet.
Yeah.
And I mean, we went back to this beauty shot here and just looking at this. Every time I go up there, it's amazing to see the differences just in this site. It really is a special place. And you taste it when you taste the wine.
Yeah,
right?
absolutely.
That is one where I think that's, again, like you said earlier, site trumps all with this wine, and that wine is all about
there's
site.
some sites that are very, they don't impart a lot of character to the wine, and the clones and the rootstocks really take over, and the management of the vineyard takes over. This is one where the site, no matter what I do to the vines, no matter what clones you plant there, no matter it's always going to have a certain signature.
Yep.
And I think that's what makes that site special.
Yeah, and then it's just trying to do things that add complexity and layers to it, right?
add
Let
layers.
it shine through.
So we've talked a lot about L Block specifically. We have other Pinot Noirs, but I want to talk a little bit about Chardonnay. I've been sipping on this Carneros Chardonnay, and so I'm ready to start talking about Chardonnay. So why don't we talk a little bit about, briefly, because mostly Chardonnay is very similar to sparkling wine, and we've talked a lot about sparkling wine viticulture already to ad nauseum for this masterclass. So I don't want to talk too much more about it, but Chardonnay is like they call it the winemaker's grape, right? It's the grape that takes on what you do to it. So both in the vineyard and in the cellar. In the vineyard, if we treat it like sparkling wine and we treat it in the cellar like sparkling wine, we can get something beautiful like this. I think this is a super elegant. This is one of my just a step past the Vin Clair base wines that we make for sparkling. And we use actually one of the same vineyards that we use for sparkling. We pretty much split it down the middle. Half of it goes for sparkling production and makes really awesome sparkling wine, and half of it gets used for still wine and goes into this Carneros Chardonnay. The beauty of this block is there's some other stuff sprinkled in with the Chardonnay. There's some, well, it's also Chardonnay, but it's Muscat clone. So it's very aromatic, very floral clone of Chardonnay that's sprinkled in that block. And it's subtle, but it makes a difference in this wine. It really adds a layer of delicate white flower aromatics that is just so beautiful. And we picked this one a little earlier than we do all of our other still Chardonnay. So this one is picked, around 22 bricks, which is between your traditional California Chardonnay and sparkling wine, pretty much right down the middle. And so when I farm these grapes, I'm thinking of this like I would farm sparkling wine. Low stress. We want a really cool site. We want a high acid clone, and we want to protect those grapes from the sunlight. So those are the things that I'm looking for when I'm farming for this style of Chardonnay. Like we said, Chardonnay takes on what you do to it. It's a grape that's easy to manipulate.
Yeah, in both the vineyard and the winery. And it's one of those ones where I think delaying the time that you can pick and giving yourself that hang time to develop those flavors, because you are picking at such low sugars, right? I mean, this is usually that interim pick where we keep the crew busy between sparkling and still harvest, right? Where we're looking at this, and because you're picking at low sugars, just giving yourself that extra hang time to develop those more mature flavors so that you do create the distinction. And it's very subtle, right? And again, it's also waiting for that acidity to calm down to a point where
that block is it's one of the coldest blocks. For sparkling wine, it's one of the last blocks we pick. It's the block that we have issues. It's the only block that we have issues with frosts at Circle Bar. It is the coldest, one of the coldest sites. All the cold air from L Block in the hills above it all flows down at nighttime and sits right on that block. And when you walk into that block from the neighboring at like 4 or 5 in the morning during harvest, you can feel the temperature drop by like 8 to 10 degrees. Like it gets so cold.
It's actually up on the screen right now. It's the one yellow block in the center of all of the red over there at Circle Bar.
The sea of Pinot.
The
There's
sea
a
of
little
Pinot
bit of Chardonnay at the bottom there.
So it's 01, and we take that side that's closer to the Pinot Noir to keep that for the still wine. And again, it's really that combination of not only the Muscat clone, but giving it that little bit of extra time. That just creates a wine that is so elegant.
And this is not a site that would lead to producing a more robust style of Chardonnay. This site is perfect for this elegant, tons of minerality, a little bit of that white flower.
Yeah.
But this is a wine that's, I mean, why don't we talk a little bit
Sure.
while we're talking about it? Talk about the cellar and how you handle this wine in the cellar.
Yeah, this wine really it's an unoaked Chardonnay, so 0 oak goes into this. You have to be very gentle with it because again, you're working with a much lower alcohol. Sometimes, depending on the year, we will macerate it. And macerate it means to put it in the press and leave it on the skins with the caps of the press closed so that we keep the juice in contact with the skins for just a little bit longer.
You can pick up some bodies.
Yeah,
some
so you pick up the aromatic. It's really about trying to drive the aromatics out of that Muscat clone. But it's also about, utilizing a little bit more grape solids there so that you have a little bit of texture to the wine because you're not going to use that oak later in the profile. So it's really about thinking about this wine as a total package from when you're going to pick it all the way to what it wants to be at the very end.
And essentially, you're treating it just like we treat it very similar to sparkling wine, base wine. In the vineyard, you're doing the same in the cellar. It's getting it's cold fermented. It's direct pressed. And no oak. It's very similar to our style of sparkling wine.
I think this is a Chardonnay that you have to focus on the acid. And it's very apparent, and that's really what the pick decision comes down to, is when you get to the flavor profile that we're looking for, right? We get into that citrus-driven, it's key lime, right when you hit that key lime. So it starts to soften out and become a little bit sweeter, but you need
still, it starts like lime.
Yes.
Then it goes to a little bit sweeter, maybe just getting some stone fruit. But I think you're right. I think that's one where, and you have to be careful because if you go too early,
you can go way
it can
too
be aggressive acidity.
And you want to make sure that the acid is crisp and that it stays, but it's not overbearing, right? This is very tough because you're not going to use any other winemaking techniques other than the purity that you get from the vineyard and maybe a little maceration. There's no oak, there's no maturation time, right? This wine is very early to bottle. We bottle this in February the following year. So we're talking about 4 months after harvest and only sees stainless steel. And the reason for that is to create a very distinct profile with our Appellation Series wines that give you something, but you need to focus on that texture early on because you're not going to have anything to use later in the process.
So what would you compare, if you had to compare this wine to something, what would you compare it to? Because most people think California or Carnero Chardonnay, they think of this big oaky, juicy, alcoholic wine, robust wine.
This to me is Chablis through and through, right? It's got the mineral note, it's got the fresh fruit, it's got just that really lovely soft acidity.
Yeah, this isn't your grandma's Chardonnay.
No,
this is something really elegant, and really special.
This is the
wine I give to people that say, "Oh,
I don't like Chardonnay.
I don't like Chardonnays. Give me anything but a Chardonnay."
Yeah.
You give them this, maybe you soak the label and scratch it off so they can't read it, and they'll love this wine.
Yeah, I think this wine fits so perfectly into our Appellation Series, but also our aromatic white series. And we make some other aromatic whites as well. We make Pinot Blanc, we make Rosé of Pinot Noir. And the focus there is focus on the acid.
And those are both those wines are made in very similar style to this. And like we said, very similar style to our sparkling wines. And so when we talk about Pinot Blanc, we're not removing leaves. We're trying to protect them from the sun. We are making sure we are giving very low stress. Our Pinot Blanc, which is at the home ranch, is planted on some of our really clay loam, deep soils where they experience very little stress. It's a cool site. It maintains its acidity, very similar to what the story is with this wine. Just a different grape varietal. And that wine I think is very elegant, but I think it's a very refreshing wine.
Yeah.
That's a wine that you and I have talked about. We love to crush that wine during the summer. It's a dangerous wine because it's so drinkable.
It goes down quick.
It goes down easy and it's delicious. And you get these interesting fruit characters. You get some like honeydew melon, you get some cantaloupe, but you also get some florals in there. Pinot Blanc is a really pretty, I think, highly underrated variety.
It is, and what I focus on in the cellar with those aromatic varieties, and then trying to tease the aromatics out of Pinot Noir, which that early in the process is still, you lend to be more sparkling, where the aromatics are a little sharp, they're spicy, you get that really pop of fruit, but it's great when you have sparkling and you have some bubbles and you have maturation time in the bottle. With still wine, you kind of have to lean a little bit more into different components. We try and retain a lot of esters during fermentation. Esters are a specific compound that's produced very heavily by the yeast in the first third of fermentation. So Temperature with
First few days.
yeah,
kind of thing.
temperature with sparkling, I'll tend to be a little bit more loose with because we're trying to influence the aromatics, but more so we're trying to influence the texture. With still wines, temperature and pH are the two things that we have to focus on, right? So we always try and drive that pH down to maintain freshness, but we ferment much colder. About 15% colder than we do any of our sparkling wines. And the reason for that is to make sure that these aromatic precursors, once they're actually formed, the compounds that they form are very fragile. They can break apart very easily, and you'll see if you ferment them warm that estery note will come out for about a day. And if you're fermenting it too hot, you come back the next day and you're tasting through fermenters and you're like, where did it go?
Yeah.
What happened to it? So the reason we ferment cold is so that we can actually try and preserve these aromatics during that first third of fermentation. And then we try and ferment these a little bit slower than we do sparkling because we want the development of these complex styles and esters to actually stay with us for a longer period of time. And to do that, you need to create more of them, right? You're going to lose some to degradation from oxygen as you age for this 3-4 months before we put it in bottle. So we try and overshoot the production of those so that we retain them in the finished wine. And again, focusing on acidity and the balance between body and acidity. Right, so a lot of times we'll do maturation on lees, where we keep the wine on the grape solids from fermentation, and we'll actually mix that, which we don't on sparkling. We try and get it off as clean and as quick as possible. With still wines, especially this Carneros Chardonnay or our Rosé or our Pinot Blanc, I will have the cellar actually mix lees back into the tank. So what happens is, as we start that aging process, those lees have settled to the bottom of the tank. They create a bed of solids on the bottom, and we'll mix that back in. We put a little nitrogen down in the bottom of the tank, kick it up, and we'll take samples to make sure that we're mixing it appropriately.
Make the wine cloudy with that yeast.
Yep, and let that yeast kind of start to autolyze and give away a little bit of its character and a little bit of the compounds that it likes to get rid of, but also the polysaccharides that are in the grape skins themselves that have made it through that little fine. Because when you have these still wines, we're looking at a different target for what's called turbidity. So how cloudy is the wine? So when we ferment with sparkling wine, we tend to ferment pretty clean. We don't want any.
You want it crystal clear.
Yes, we want clear wines. We want enough turbidity for the yeast to stay in suspension so that they don't all sit at the bottom of the tank. But with the still wines, we're looking at a specific target. So we will actually take these wines to a very close target, which we've set up, and do that all by visual assessment of and a turbidometer of how much turbidity is in the wine. And that really makes a difference. If you add more of that, you run the risk of getting some off flavors. And if you run not enough, you run the risk of the yeast getting upset because they don't have enough to stay in suspension. So it's a much more technical start to the process, whereas sparkling, a lot of the technicality comes at the very end of the process, the assemblage, right? So here, because we aren't doing that secondary fermentation bottle with any of these still wines, we need to make sure that we do all of our work up front, and temperature and pH are the things that we pay attention to the most.
I think I want to touch on one more thing before we move on to the Vista wine, the Vista Reserve wines. Our still rosé.
Yep.
The beauty of that still rosé is we have so many clones. We have so many clones that are so perfect for still rosé because they're sparkling wine clones.
Yep.
And still wine Pinot Noir clones don't necessarily make the best rosés. Like I said, the goals are different, right?
Correct,
The goalposts are different.
Yep.
So we're shooting for different things when we're making a red wine like this versus a rosé. We want that bright acidity, that freshness, no tannin, and we can still get a little bit of color. So we have some awesome sites at the Circle Bar Ranch that we actually use 2 different vineyards and blend them together to make that still rosé.
Yep.
So let's move on to the Vista Reserve wine. So we have 2 Vista Reserves. We have Vista Reserve Pinot Noir.
Yep.
And we have Vista Reserve Chardonnay. Let's talk a little bit. Let's start with the Pinot Noir. Talk about the difference between the Carneros Chardonnay, the El Bloc, and the Vista.
Yeah, so with those 3 tiers of wine, it's really to showcase 3 different things. And you start very broad, right? We have Carneros Pinot in our glass right now. And this should be the typicity of Carneros as a whole, right? Carneros to me always screams fresh fruit, number one. A touch of earth right behind it, and aromatic complexity, right? These are wines that are very pure.
And
They're
I
very
think brightness and
fresh.
acidity as
Yes,
well.
brightness and acidity. So with Carneros Pinot Noir, it's a wine that once we get it off the skins and we go into the aging process, it sees no new oak. And the reason for that is just to showcase the fruit and let it shine through, but also showcase the vintage and the site that it was grown. These are wines that are early to release in the Carneros series, both Carneros Chardonnay and Carneros Pinot Noir. Purity of fruit, higher elevated acidity. They're very approachable when they're young. This is definitely kind of your everyday drinker.
Yeah.
You want to see a lot of complexity on a lot of different layers. It just hit a lot of notes.
And this one to me is all red fruit.
Oh, it's red. Yeah.
Screaming, it's screaming red fruit, raspberry, cranberry. It's really a pretty red fruit wine. But like you said, with that earthiness, that baking spice, it's all still there. But it doesn't have that oak character.
But it's all of
the
those
oak is there, but
secondary-
it's way in the back.
So all we use is neutral oak.
Yeah.
So two barrels that what I consider neutral are third fill or
older. Or more older than that. Yeah.
And that's where we get just a touch of complexity there, because you do still part a little bit of oak character, but not any of that.
And it's
really,
more texture based.
It's texture and it's used for the maturation of the wine. When we get into the reserve series, right, we always start with L Block first for Pinot Noir. And the reason for that is L Block is a barrel selection. So out of L Block, one, it's a single block off the property, whereas Carneros and Vista are multiple blocks off the property. L Block is just a single block. It should represent L Block in its entirety. It should scream that site, but also it is the best barrels of that block. So every year when we put these down to barrel, there's a selection of different coopers that we use, and we talked in earlier master
Coopers
classes.
being the barrel producers.
The barrel producers. We talked in earlier master classes about our goals with oak for sparkling. Just like on the farming side, where your goals are completely different for farming still versus sparkling, the use of oak in the cellar here is completely different for still versus sparkling wine. I focus on coopers and producers of oak that highlight the fruit and provide structure to a varietal that is notorious. Pinot Noir is notorious for, if you use the wrong oak, it's when you can it'll overshadow it.
It's such a delicate grape.
And really just, it becomes disjointed and bitter and astringent. So highlighting coopers that are lighter, we use lighter toasts. We use very forests that are derived for giving freshness to the wine.
So the forest that the trees come from to make the barrels.
Exactly. So
give the style to
within each, and this is my favorite part about oak, within each cooper, they use different forests, and even if they're within the same forest, let's say maybe it's the region of Allier, and you have two coopers that get wood from the same forest, you get completely different barrels. But generally, regionally, the forests tend to provide different things, and it's something that it's a trial and error process, right? But for us, we tend to be on the lighter side. We tend to be on things that give a bit more softness and structure to the wine.
And that's where, when you're making L Block,
yes, you
go through and you taste, we may have 20 barrels from L Block, but maybe only 12 of them make it into that final L Block blend.
It's vintage dependent, right? Sometimes it's 6, sometimes it's 5, sometimes it's 12.
Yeah, you don't know.
It's whatever the best. We start broad, right? And you've done this with us as well. We taste through every single barrel. We give every barrel a grade at the end, right before. So this is different. The whole lot got a grade when we did the grading tasting right after harvest. We do a grading and tasting again for L Block and say, here are the A barrels. Okay, here are the B barrels, and there better not be any C barrels, right? Yeah. And so out of the Bs, they get moved down. The As, okay, now we're going to create a blend of all the As. What is that? And then we kind of start ripping it a whole, it's got too much this, it's too much that. Okay, from the A's, let's look at what we like. And we craft an individual one. That one had a bit too much chocolate.
There may be 10 A-grade barrels, but maybe only 7 or 8 of them make it into the final blend because the other ones just don't mesh.
Yes. Yeah. So with L Block, it is a barrel selection. From there, it becomes a selection of Vista. And we look at, because Carneros gets no new oak, all of the new oak barrels that didn't make it into L Block, they make it into Vista. And then we start tasting through individual barrels and looking for fruit character. And if it's red fruit, we start going to Carneros. And if it's black fruit, like blackberry, blackcurrant, blueberry, things like that, we send it to Vista. Okay, and then we start crafting it this way and make sure that it makes sense. So L Block comes first, same with all of our reserve Chardonnays. And then Vista comes second, black fruit for Vista Pinot Noir. a culmination of the blocks on our property and looking at what our Chardonnay program is. It needs to have aromatic complexity. It needs to be pure fruit. It needs to be a step above Carneros because in weight, because we have some oak there.
Yes.
And then Carneros Chardonnay is very easy. It is all of the Chardonnay that didn't see oak.
Yeah.
So it really becomes...
That's a whole separate program.
It's a whole separate program. It really becomes driving stylistic differences, not only from the property, but from the winemaking styles that you did as well. And using oak in an effective manner, especially with our reserve wines. We just had a winemaker's dinner for our 40th, and the number one question that I got from a lot of people were, we really did not like Chardonnay, but we were tasting actually one of our reserve Chardonnays, our San Giacomo Chardonnay. We really didn't like Chardonnay, but this Chardonnay is amazing. Tell us about the differences. And it's really just taking into account that oak can be a tool, or it can overshadow things very quickly.
Yeah. So we talked about Chardonnay a little bit, taking a step back. We talked about the Carneros Chardonnay being zero oak at all, no oak at all, new or used oak. Neutral, doesn't matter. There's no oak in that. The Vista is a kind of a different style, and we farm it a little differently too. There's, that comes from mostly the home ranch, and we'll pull some leaves to get some sun exposure, get some of that like baked apple character, to get some of that stone fruit character, not just the citrus, make a little bit more full-bodied wine. It's not a huge wine, but it has lots of pleasant acidity in it. It's very fresh. It's got tons of fruit, but it has a little bit of barrel character as well.
And we really want to make sure that we're stylistically differentiating it, because when people sit down in the tasting room, the number one thing that we want is to make sure that you can go through all of these different wines and you see exactly what they were crafted for, right? And I think that's a perfect time
before we go to questions, let's just talk about the single vineyard Chardonnays.
Yes.
I don't want to miss out on those. I want people to get the stories behind those. It'll only take a couple minutes, but this is a relatively new program.
It is.
So we have our Carneros Chardonnay, we have our Vista Reserve Chardonnay. Both of those are estate grown. And then we have our 2 single vineyard Chardonnays. For Pinot Noir, we have the El Bloc Pinot Noir. That's our special single vineyard Pinot Noir. But we have our San Giacomo. So the San Giacomo family, I think it's important to remember and to talk about. Their family, they have vineyards that are right up the road from us. Before Gloria Ferrer even had vineyards planted, they were selling fruit for the first vintages of our sparkling wines.
They're one of the pioneers of Carneros.
They're one of the pioneers of Carneros. We have a long-standing relationship with the San Giacomo family, and we've been doing business with them for a long time. And so when we decided to create a single vineyard Chardonnay, they were the obvious choice. They are phenomenal farmers. They are world-class growers of grapes, and they specialize in Chardonnay. And so going to them to find us a very special Chardonnay, a very special vineyard, and now we've worked with this vineyard for 3 years, and this is an even different style of Chardonnay.
So this is definitely the bigger reserve, where Vista should encompass Carneros as an appellation and our estate, which our estate is about the purity of fruit, it's about the elegance, it's about the texture. The clone of Chardonnay that we get from San Giacomo is Old Wenty clone, much different conical structure or small structure. Yes, small berries, shot berries, where sometimes there are a lot of chicks and hens where you get very small berries and big berries on the same cluster.
Tons of intensity of flavor.
It is the vineyard that is the most impossible to sample, and when we pick this, I don't go
crapshoot because you think it's going to be where you want it, but you have no idea.
I don't go off numbers at all with this.
Yeah, you just have to walk
the block and you're like, in 2 days, this is going to be exactly where I want it. Call Steve and tell him to pick it.
And we're lucky. We're lucky because Mike and Steve San Giacomo are just like the easiest people to work with, and they know what they're doing. They're true professionals. And I'm a control freak when it comes to the vineyards. I know exactly what I want, and they do a great job getting us exactly what we want out of that vineyard. And then we let them take a lot of the decisions because it's a representation of their vineyard.
And that's what we want it to be. So with the single vineyard wines, both San Giacomo and Durrell, both 2 families that we've been working with for a long time, 2 vineyards that we've been working with for a long time. The intent there is to create 2 very equal but distinctly different wines.
Both single
vineyards.
Yeah.
It should be a representation of the site. San Giacomo becomes much more robust. It becomes much more ripe. We use a little bit higher oak. We go a little bit higher than we do on any of our wines with the San Giacomo. Again, still very lactose, still using coopers that respect the fruit, but we want to showcase
Chardonnay after all.
Yeah, we don't want to smack it over the head with it, but it's about creating a wine that is full malolactic but doesn't taste buttery, and it's a wine that has weight and structure, but still retains its elegance. On the opposite end of the spectrum, you have Durell. Durell's a newer release for us, 2023. We started working with this specific block, yes, but we need to create a wine that is much more, I call it more Sonoma Coast driven. And this appellation actually is in the Sonoma Coast. It's not Sonoma Carneros. We're up in the hills outside on the western part of the valley.
And Durell is a super historic vineyard in the Sonoma Valley and Sonoma Coast. I mean, it is half in Carneros and half of it is outside of Carneros in the Sonoma Coast, Sonoma Valley appellation. And it's one that we've been buying sparkling fruit from off and on for a long time, but a very historic vineyard. A lot of really special wines have come out of there. And I was bugging the vineyard director for a long time, trying to get in. There's one little section of this that's just known for producing some of the best Chardonnays in California. And someone, walked out and left their block, and we had the opportunity to come in. And I couldn't believe it because we went and saw that vineyard and we were like, why would you ever walk away from that? Sign the contract now.
Today.
And it's just the most amazing soils. It goes up and down hillsides. It's just the vines look like a museum. They're so manicured.
It's beautiful. And with that wine, it's really about creating a wine that is it's much more white burgundy, right? It's mineral, it's flinty. The oak drops down. The fruit is kind of in between Carneros Chardonnay and Vista Chardonnay, where we don't go fully ripe, but we still retain the riper style of citrus. We don't go to stone fruit like we do with
it's
with
definitely more citrus, right? And maybe just getting into the continuum being like citrus, stone fruit, apple.
It's that like underripe peach where we're not full summer peach where it's juicy and textured. It's that kind of,
it's a little restrained.
Yes, and for me that wine is all about tension.
Yes.
Right. So when we're tasting this, it's like that wine should be very tight and focused all the way through the palate.
We're still getting to know the site. This is only our second vintage working with it. But we're really excited about it, and we're really excited to see what it can do. So
it's a special wine.
So why don't we take some questions now? And we'll go.
So what were the primary factors that drove wanting to produce still wines in addition to sparkling? Was it a business diversity decision that allows more options to the consumer, or did the land, topography, climate of certain blocks drive the still wine direction due to factors not good for sparkling? That is a very complex question.
That's a great question.
It is a very good question.
I can start by saying there are sites on this property that do not lend themselves to making
sparkling
the best. Could you make sparkling wine off of them? Of course you could. It is, our vineyards are in a cool climate. You could make sparkling wine. Is it going to make Carneros Cuvée quality? Is it going to make Royal Cuvée quality? Probably not. But it could make something like El Block, specifically El Block. El Block would not make great quality sparkling wine, but it's going to make amazing still wine. So why try and force it to be something that it doesn't want to be? If it wants to be still wine, let's make still wine. We can make something great. And then I think on the other side, it gives our wine club members something different. If people come in tasting, they can have and they can see what these sites can do and what we can do as still wine producers as well as sparkling. And I think we also like to mix it up a little bit.
It's about the innovation side of it as well as showcasing the property as an entirety, right? We are in the business of putting out the best wine from each site. And if that site wants to be still wine, we kind of listen to it and say, this is something that will make, we were trying to put out the highest quality wine possible, and we feel that that is a still wine site. We're going to make still wine off of it. It does give our club members a little bit of sense of that intrigue as well as, hey, we do sparkling and we do it very, very well, but we also do still wine and we do that very, very well too. So
if you're a club member, you can get your still wines here as well. And it's a one-stop shop, and we can do them really well. And our sites, we have sites that are really special for still wines.
Yep.
So there's a little bit of everything in there. So that's a
So was
convoluted way of saying
that was
there's
a
lot
tough
of
question.
reasons. Yeah.
Tough question to answer. Next question we have is any malolactic fermentation in the Chardonnay? Yes. In some of our Chardonnays we do. The San Giacomo is 100% malolactic. The Carneros is 0. Vista is 100%, and it's something that I'm toying with and saying maybe it's not 100% anymore. Maybe only certain lots go through malolactic. Malolactic is something that I feel is dependent on the wine. For instance, this year, during the second year we worked with Durrell, first year, put it through malo, love the wine. It's beautiful, it's textured, it's very, very robust style wine. This year I was like, what if we did 0?
Yeah.
And then let's hold off. So started out on the aging process with no malolactic in this wine, and liked it so much that we're going to have no malo in the second year of Durrell.
Yeah.
So malolactic is a tool that we can use as winemakers to drive stylistic decisions. You do have to be careful because there's some stability implications with it. But we have a great cellar team that is very, very clean and maintains a
and I think
top
we should
quality shop.
maybe take a step back and say what is malolactic fermentation?
Sure, thank you. The malolactic fermentation is a secondary fermentation that occurs by a bacteria
After the alcoholic fermentation.
after the primary is done. I actually have started doing it simultaneous with the end of alcoholic fermentation because I really don't like diacetyl. Diacetyl is a compound that is produced by this bacteria that is it's
buttery
the movie theater popcorn butter.
Yeah.
And I don't like that, but I love the textural implications of malolactic. So we actually do it what's called co-inoculation with primary fermentation. And what the bacteria does is it turns malic acid, which is very tart, very bright, very fruit-driven,
Green
like
apple,
you would
think
find
like
in apples.
Granny Smith.
Yeah,
green
it is.
apple.
It's what you find in. It's the acid that you find in apples, and it turns that acid and converts it into lactic acid, which is that type of acid that you would find in something like milk or butter, right? So it's softer. It's still acidic, but it's softer.
It's a creamier,
It's a
softer
creamier texture,
acidity.
And what it does is it lowers the total acidity. Because it's a weaker acid, it changes your pH because as
pH goes up a little
goes
bit.
up. So there are some things that you need to think about when doing this, but it's something that we can do as winemakers that gives style to the wine.
Chardonnay is that, you have your paintbrush, you can do whatever you want with Chardonnay.
Yep.
It's,
And for me, malolactic is really it's kind of a dial, right? And some years you want a little bit more. Like 23, all of the wines went through 100% malo because it was a very cold, very long vintage, elevated levels of malic acid where the wines were out of balance without it.
Yes.
And now this year, Durrell came in exactly where we wanted. We're fortunate enough to not do it. So it's something that we do, and it will continue to evolve as the style of the wines evolves as well. So
Yeah, and something like Durrell, I mean, it's important to keep in mind all of these. This was only our 4th vintage making still wines.
Yes.
So we're still fine tuning and we're still figuring out the vineyards. It takes a long time to get to know a vineyard and to get to know what it needs to make the best wine.
Yeah.
And something like Durrell, we've only been working with 2 years.
2
San
years.
Giacomo, 3 years now. So, it's something we're learning and we're getting better and better and fine tuning these wines every year. And that's the goal, right? Is
And
to get better and better every
It's just to
vintage.
always make sure that they're evolving, make sure that you're always pushing the envelope a little bit to drive
Experimenting.
and not being complacent with saying, well, it was great last year, it's going to be great if we do it the same way this
And
year.
every vintage is a little different.
Exactly, and that's what we do. Just like with sparkling, we do it with still. We look at it and say, what does this need this year?
Yes.
How do we make the best wine in what's now going to be 2025? How are we going to
start
make the
looking at
best wine in
2025 now.
2025? So with that, we want to say thank you so much for accompanying us on this journey of our masterclass here. Hopefully you've learned a lot more about sparkling and still wine production and everything that we do here at Gloria Ferrer. And we wish you all a very happy holidays and happy new year.
Cheers.
We'll see you in 2025.